At dawn, the city believed in steel. It trusted the towers that split the sky, the bridges that braided rivers into obedience, the rails that promised speed and certainty. For decades, we told ourselves that progress had finally taught the earth how to behave. Then the morning arrived when the ground remembered its own name. A low growl rose from beneath the asphalt, not loud at first, almost intimate, like a warning whispered too late. Cups rattled. Elevators froze between floors. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that suspended second, the lie was exposed. Steel does not command the earth. It only borrows time. The tremor sharpened into a violent sentence, punctuated by cracking concrete and screaming alarms. Streets folded like paper maps. Glass fell as glittering rain. People ran without direction, not away from danger, but toward survival. Every bolt and beam we trusted was suddenly reduced to a question mark. What fails first? We wondered in terror. The machines we built, or the faith we placed in them? The earth did not answer. It kept moving. This was not a catastrophe that announced itself with flames or floods. It was colder, more humiliating. A reminder, written in pressure and motion, declaring that beneath every triumph of engineering lies a restless memory, older than cities. In that morning, steel learned humility. So did we. If this opening has pulled you into the mystery of what happened next, subscribe to the channel now. Your support gives us the strength to keep uncovering stories that challenge what we think we know, and to bring you endings you won't forget. Far from the beaches where history would soon erupt, Erwin Rommel carried a growing sense of unease that no map could quiet. He understood something many around him refused to accept. This war in the West would not be decided by elegance of maneuver or by reserves held in confidence, but by brutal seconds at the shoreline. The first clash would shape everything that followed. Delay, hesitation, or divided command would be fatal. Rommel's vision placed him at odds with the very system he served. While others trusted doctrine and hierarchy, he trusted momentum and fear. He saw the coastline not as a boundary, but as a fragile moment, one chance to break the enemy's will before it could solidify. Yet every request he made was filtered through layers of authority that diluted urgency into procedure. Tanks were kept inland, permissions deferred, decisions postponed until certainty replaced instinct. Rommel felt time slipping away, not dramatically, but quietly, which made it more dangerous. His absence from the coast was not just physical, it was symbolic. As his influence weakened, confidence returned where anxiety should have lived. Defenses remained impressive but incomplete, strong enough to wound, yet not decisive enough to end the fight. Rommel knew this kind of half-measure well. It was the most expensive mistake in war. What followed would prove that foresight without power is its own form of tragedy. Rommel did not lose a battle on those beaches. He lost a conversation, one between reality and authority that ended too soon. And in that silence, the future moved closer, unstoppable, toward the shore. Beyond the beaches and behind the headlines, another battlefield waited in silence. It was not marked by concrete or steel, but by hedgerows, so dense they felt ancient, alive, and hostile. This was the green maze that history nearly forgot, where the land itself chose sides. To those who entered it, the countryside of Normandy did not resemble open Europe. It closed in, it watched, it resisted. The hedgerows were not mere vegetation. They were walls grown over centuries, thick with roots, earth, and stone, taller than a man and wide enough to swallow sound. Visibility collapsed to a few meters. Radios failed. Maps lied. Soldiers advanced without knowing what lay 10 steps ahead. Every field became a room, every gap a doorway that might be fatal. The war here was intimate, slow, and cruel. Victory was measured in yards, paid for in blood. German defenders understood this terrain instinctively. Small units dissolved into the greenery. reappearing only to strike. There were no sweeping maneuvers, no heroic charges, just sudden gunfire, confusion, and the terrifying sense that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. For the attackers, momentum died here. Armor stalled, doctrine unraveled, confidence drained away with every unseen shot. This landscape did what fortifications could not. It stripped war down to fear and patience. Men learned to listen to leaves, to distrust silence, to move not with strategy, but with instinct. History would remember the beaches, the speeches, the flags, but in this green maze, the war was decided one hedgerow at a time, unseen, uncelebrated, and unforgettable to those who survived it. When American doctrine entered Normandy, it arrived with confidence forged on training grounds and proven in distant campaigns. It believed in coordination, in clear lines of advance, in firepower applied with precision and speed. On paper, it was modern, flexible, and humane. In reality, it met a battlefield that refused to behave. The Green Maze dismantled assumptions with ruthless efficiency. Units trained to move as combined arms found themselves fragmented by hedgerows that blocked vision, movement, and communication. Tanks, meant to dominate, became blind giants trapped in narrow corridors. Infantry advanced without armor. Armor waited without infantry, and doctrine, so carefully refined, began to feel abstract, even naive. Orders lost relevance within minutes of being given. Initiative shifted downward, not by design, but by necessity. American soldiers adapted because survival demanded it. Junior officers and enlisted men began to rewrite the war in real time, improvising tactics with whatever tools and instincts they had. Explosives were welded to tank fronts. Assaults became intimate, violent, and exhausting. Courage remained, but certainty did not. Each hedgerow forced a reckoning. No manual could explain what waited on the other side. This was not failure in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more unsettling, the realization that technology and doctrine could only carry men so far. Beyond that point, war reverted to its oldest form: fear, learning, and loss paid forward. In Normandy's fields, American doctrine did not collapse. It bent, painfully, under the weight of reality. And in that bending, it revealed a truth history often avoids: that victory is not born from plans alone, but from how quickly those plans are abandoned when the world refuses to cooperate. They fought without horizons, not because the future was unclear, but because the land refused to show them even 10 meters ahead. For the infantrymen, Normandy was not a map of objectives and arrows. It was a series of narrow, suffocating moments, each bounded by dirt walls and tangled green that swallowed light and sound. The world shrank to the length of a rifle barrel. Every advance was blind. Men climbed over hedgerows without knowing if they would land in silence or death. The enemy was never seen in formation, never approached from a distance. Gunfire erupted from nowhere, then vanished. Fear did not arrive in waves. It stayed, constant and intimate, pressing against the chest with every step. There was no sweeping sense of progress, no visible breakthrough, only exhaustion layered on top of dread. Leadership became personal here. Orders mattered less than trust in the man beside you. Junior leaders made decisions that generals would never read about. Choices measured in seconds that meant life or disappearance. Infantrymen learned to read the ground the way sailors read the sea, sensing danger in stillness, in birds that fled too suddenly, in hedgerows that felt wrong. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on attention. What history often overlooks is how small these battles felt to those inside them. No speeches, no flags, no clear victories, just men advancing yard by yard, carrying the weight of a war that had narrowed to a single field, a single wall, a single heartbeat. They were infantrymen without horizons, fighting not for glory, but for the right to see the next sunrise from the same side of the hedgerow. Above the choking hedgerows and the shattered lanes, decisions were made in rooms far removed from the noise of gunfire. Maps lay flat, clean, and orderly. Untouched by mud or blood, here, time moved differently. Caution felt like wisdom. Waiting felt like control. And while generals weighed options and searched for certainty, an army paid for that hesitation in bodies. The plan demanded patience. Breakthrough would come, eventually, once pressure accumulated and the enemy weakened. But on the ground, patience translated into exposure. Infantry units were ordered forward without relief, without armor, without clarity. They attacked positions that should have been bypassed, held ground that offered no advantage, and waited under fire for decisions that arrived too late to matter. Every pause above the battlefield stretched into casualties below it. This was the quiet cruelty of command at a distance. No single order doomed the army. No single general chose sacrifice. Instead, blood was spent incrementally, rationally, almost invisibly. Losses were reported as numbers, positions as symbols. The human cost dissolved into language that softened reality. Those fighting did not experience delay as strategy. They experienced it as abandonment. What made this moment so devastating was not incompetence, but restraint taken too far. Fear of failure bred inaction. Fear of losing control delayed adaptation. And while the command waited for the perfect moment, the imperfect war continued relentlessly. History often celebrates restraint as maturity, but there are moments when waiting becomes its own form of violence. In Normandy's fields, the army learned this lesson the hard way. The general waited. The army bled. And between those two truths lay a silence filled with names that would never appear on any map. Change did not come from the maps or the waiting rooms. It came from a sergeant whose name history barely remembers, standing knee-deep in mud and fear, staring at ground that had already taken too many men. He did not have the luxury of doctrine or delay. What he had was responsibility for the living beside him, and for the dead behind him. The hedgerow in front of his squad was just another wall on the map, another obstacle to be cleared by procedure. To him, it was a decision point. Charging it head-on meant more bodies. Waiting meant the same. So he refused both. He studied the earth like a problem that could be solved, not endured, where others saw impassable terrain. He saw weakness, soil piled high, roots holding centuries of growth together, a barrier strong only if respected, under fire, with no permission, asked, and no orders coming. He acted. He scavenged tools, coordinated quietly, improvised brutally. Men followed not because they were ordered, but because hesitation felt worse than risk. What happened next was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was violent, chaotic, exhausting, but it worked. The ground gave way. That single act did not win the campaign. It did something more important. It broke the spell of inevitability. Word spread, not through communiques, but through survival. Others adapted. The land began to lose its power. History often credits generals for turning points, but wars also pivot on moments when someone close enough to die refuses to accept the battlefield as it is handed to them. The sergeant did not change the war by waiting for permission. He changed it by deciding the ground did not get the final say. Innovation in Normandy did not arrive with announcements or approvals. It arrived quietly, shaped by hands blackened with grease and fear. Blueprints stayed folded. Manuals lost relevance. What mattered was what could be built, welded, or torn apart before the next attack began. Thinking shifted from theory to touch. Men stopped asking what should work and focused on what might. Tanks became laboratories. Scrap metal was cut, bolted, and welded into crude extensions of will. Explosives were repurposed, engines abused, equipment pushed far beyond what it was designed to endure. Nothing was elegant. Everything was urgent. The battlefield demanded solutions that could survive contact with mud, roots, and gunfire, not approval from distant desks. This kind of thinking was uncomfortable for an army raised on planning and precision. It required admitting that the war had outpaced instruction. It asked soldiers to trust instincts over diagrams, experience over hierarchy. Failure was immediate and unforgiving, but success spread fast. A working idea did not need explanation. It needed replication. What emerged was a different rhythm of war, less predictable, more human. Progress came not from synchronized movements, but from accumulated improvisation. Each small breakthrough carved space for the next. The hedgerows did not disappear, but they lost their authority. The land could still kill, but it could no longer dictate terms unchallenged. History often frames adaptation as brilliance. On the ground, it felt more like desperation sharpened into clarity. Thinking with hands was not a philosophy. It was survival made visible. And in that shift, from blueprints to bruises, from doctrine to dirt, the army rediscovered a truth as old as conflict itself. When the plan fails, the war belongs to those who can build a new one under fire. Rommel had imagined steel as certainty. Obstacles, mines, concrete, and iron driven into the coast were meant to impose order on chaos, to freeze the enemy at the moment of arrival. That vision did not disappear when the land war moved inland. It changed hands. In the hedgerows, steel was stripped of its symbolism and returned to its simplest purpose: force applied with intent. The defenses Rommel had championed no longer stood as barriers, but as raw material. Metal meant to stop tanks was cut apart to reshape them. Obstacles designed to kill became tools to survive. The enemy did not defeat Rommel's steel by avoiding it. They absorbed it, altered it, and turned it forward. This was the quiet reversal of power. What had once been imposed from above was now forged from below. Welders, mechanics, infantrymen with no patience left for theory took control of the material reality of war. Steel was no longer static. It moved, adapted, scarred, and endured. Every modification carried risk, but also intent. It was not designed to last. It was designed to work now. Rommel understood steel as preparation. His opponents learned it as conversation with the battlefield. Each impact, each failure, reshaped the next attempt. In that process, the Atlantic Wall's philosophy collapsed, not because it was weak, but because rigidity cannot survive contact with necessity. History remembers Rommel for his vision. What followed proved something harsher. Steel does not belong to the planner forever. In war, it is claimed by whoever is willing to remake it under fire. And once reforged, it no longer defends ideas, it advances realities, carrying the momentum of those who refuse to let the battlefield remain unchanged. Before the breakthrough came, there was a silence that felt unnatural. Not the absence of sound, guns still fired, shells still landed, but a pause in meaning. The front stopped moving. Lines bent but did not break. Every side sensed that something was about to give. Yet, no one could name when or where. The war held its breath. For those on the ground, this silence was heavy. Attacks continued, losses mounted, but progress felt abstract. Villages changed hands, only to be abandoned. Fields were taken at dawn and lost by nightfall. Men learned not to celebrate survival, because survival often meant returning to the same place the next day. Momentum existed only in rumors. Above them, pressure accumulated, supplies flowed, replacements arrived, and plans were refined again and again. Each revision promised clarity. Each one delayed commitment. Command waited for the moment when certainty would justify risk on the battlefield. That waiting translated into endurance tests measured in nerve and fatigue. Rommel's shadow still lingered over the defenses, not as a presence, but as a reminder of what a decisive moment could look like. Both sides sensed it approaching. The Teray had been studied, scarred, and partially tamed. Improvisation had created tools where doctrine had failed. The pieces were in place, even if no one admitted it yet. Silence like this does not last. It is the sound of systems reaching their limit. When the break finally comes, it feels sudden only to those who are not paying attention. In Normandy, the quiet before the break was not peace. It was pressure, waiting for a single point of release where the war would change shape forever. The day the hedges screamed was not marked by a date anyone remembers. It was felt instead, like a rupture running through soil and nerve at the same time. The countryside that had swallowed men in silence finally gave voice, not in words, but in violence layered upon violence. Steel cut into earth. Engines roared where whispers once ruled. The hedgerows did not fall quietly. They resisted, tore, exploded, and burned. For weeks, the land had dictated the pace of war. Now the balance shifted. Tanks surged forward with crude blades biting into roots and stone, ripping open passages that had never existed. Artillery hammered positions that had relied on concealment more than strength. Infantry followed close, no longer pausing at every wall of green, but driving through gaps carved moments earlier. The battlefield stopped feeling ancient. It felt raw. This was not a clean breakthrough. It was chaotic, deafening, and terrifying for everyone involved. The hedgerows screamed because they were being violated, because centuries of stillness were being undone in minutes. German defenses, built to exploit containment and surprise, struggled to survive motion and depth. Positions that had been lethal in isolation collapsed once pressure refused to stop. Men who had lived for weeks inside narrow fears suddenly found space. Not safety, but direction. The war stretched outward again. Horizons returned, even if they were filled with smoke. Momentum, long denied, became undeniable. History often frames turning points as elegant maneuvers. This one was brutal and loud. It was the sound of a battlefield losing control over the men fighting on it. When the hedges screamed, it was not just the land that broke, it was the stalemate. And once broken, it would never fully return. For a long time in Normandy, survival had been the only measurable success. Holding a position through the night, crossing a single field, keeping enough men alive to move again in the morning. These were victories that went unnamed. Momentum was something discussed in headquarters, not felt in the mud. Then, almost without ceremony, that balance shifted. The change was not dramatic at first. It arrived as continuity. Attacks no longer stalled at the first obstacle. Units pushed through instead of pausing to reorganize. Losses still came, but they began to purchase space rather than simply endure it. Roads appeared where none had existed. Villages stopped being traps and started becoming passages. The war loosened its grip. What mattered most was psychological. Soldiers who had learned to expect ambush now expected movement. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It no longer paralyzed. It sharpened. Command decisions grew bolder, not because confidence returned, but because experience replaced uncertainty. The army was no longer asking whether the ground could be taken, but how far it could be carried. Rommel's defensive logic depended on containment, on slowing, bleeding, and exhausting the attacker until momentum died. Once momentum survived contact, that logic unraveled. The battlefield stopped favoring the static and began rewarding the adaptive time. Once an ally of defense, turned hostile. History often compresses this transition into a single operation or name. In reality, it was a collective realization spreading through ranks and roads alike. The war moved from endurance to intent, from reacting to imposing, from survival to momentum, and once that line was crossed, the outcome ceased to be a question of possibility, becoming instead a matter of time. When the steel finally rusts, when obstacles are pulled from fields and machines return to silence, what remains is not the metal, but the memory of how it was challenged. Normandy today bears little resemblance to the battlefield it once was. The hedgerows still stand, quieter now, indifferent to the meaning once forced upon them. Concrete crumbles, iron fades, yet the war endures in less visible forms. What lasts is not the brilliance of plans or the scale of defenses, but the moment when certainty failed and adaptation took its place. The lesson is uncomfortable because it strips power from symbols. Steel promised control. Doctrine promised order. Both were undone by terrain, friction, and human limits. What replaced them was not genius, but persistence sharpened by necessity. Rommel's vision, formidable and intelligent, ultimately proved incomplete, not because it lacked strength, but because it trusted rigidity in a world that punished it. His opponents did not win by being stronger in steel alone, but by refusing to let steel define the terms of the fight. They bent, learned, and reimagined the battlefield until it yielded. History often seeks permanence in objects, walls, weapons, victories etched into monuments. But endurance lives elsewhere. It lives in the willingness to abandon certainty, in the courage to act without permission when reality demands it, and in the quiet understanding that survival is not the end of struggle, but its beginning. After the steel rusts, what endures is this: wars are not decided by what is built to last, but by what can change fast enough. And long after the battlefield fades, that truth remains, waiting for the next moment when the world refuses to behave as planned. When this story ends, what remains is not a single victory or defeat, but the portrait of a man and a system caught between certainty and change. Erwin Rommel stands at the center of that tension. He was perceptive, driven, and often correct in his understanding of how the battlefield would behave. Yet his story in Normandy is not one of decisive command, but of limits, limits of authority, of structure, of timing. Around him, soldiers on all sides were forced to abandon what they believed war should look like and confront what it actually was. Steel, doctrine, and preparation mattered, but none of them were enough on their own. The deeper lesson of this story is uncomfortable but powerful. Being right is not the same as being effective. Preparation without flexibility becomes fragility. Systems that punish adaptation in favor of control eventually collapse under their own weight. On the other side, survival turned into momentum only when individuals were willing to think, act, and change faster than circumstances demanded. Progress came not from perfect plans, but from imperfect action taken at the right moment. Applied to life today. The message is clear. Careers, relationships, and goals rarely unfold according to blueprint. Waiting for certainty can quietly cost more than taking a calculated risk. Growth often begins when we stop defending old structures and start reshaping them. Like the battlefield, life rewards those who adapt, learn, and move forward despite incomplete information. Before we close, here's a question for you. What matters more when facing uncertainty? A. Careful planning. The ability to adapt quickly. Comment or B below. And what's your perspective on this story and its lesson? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from each other. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us and stay with us for the next powerful story.